When I was 5, I decided I needed an older brother the way other children needed shoes.
My mother said brothers did not grow on trees, so
I spent an afternoon checking every tree behind our house anyway. We lived at the edge of a wind-beaten fishing town where roofs rested. Gulls screamed like unpaid debt, and everybody knew everybody's grief. Before breakfast, I was certain the sea owed me one miracle. That winter, after a 3-day storm, our old sheepdog started barking. At the abandoned smokehouse by the pier, I followed him through sleet, half curious and half hoping the sea had finally delivered. Inside, curled behind a collapsed crate, was a boy maybe 2 years older than me. He wore a school blazer too fine for our town and shoes so expensive they looked ashamed of the mud clinging to them. His lips were blue, his hands were cut, one cheek was swollen. When I touched his sleeve, he flinched like a stray colt and stared at me with the strangest eyes I had ever seen, cold at first, then frightened by their own coldness. I ran home screaming that the storm had washed up an older brother. My mother came with a lantern, a blanket, and the practical temper of a woman who had no time for nonsense but plenty of room for mercy. She did not ask whose child he was until after she had wrapped him, fed him broth, and bullied the clinic doctor into coming out in the dark. In our house, rescue always arrived before questions. For 2 days, the boy said nothing except one word in his sleep, Elias. It turned out to be his name. He remembered little else, only that a man had pushed him out of a car on the highway before dawn. The police took a statement called Surrounding Cities, checked missing child reports, and found nothing that matched. My mother sighed, the sigh of a woman adopting trouble before the paperwork had even started, so Elias stayed. At first, he slept sitting upright, as if a bed were a trick. He ate like he expected food to vanish. He thanked my mother for water. He thanked me for not speaking while he was thinking. He was terrible at being a child and excellent at everything else. Within a month, he had repaired our radio, sorted my schoolbooks by subject and difficulty, and taught himself the rhythm of our town better than some people born in it. I was the opposite. I climbed roofs, lied badly when caught, and entered every room as if I were owed applause. Elias watched me with quiet horror, the way priests must look at fireworks stored in a chapel. Still, when older children mocked my patched uniform, Elias stood beside me without a word. They stopped laughing after he stared at them with such concentrated contempt that even adults shifted under it. When I was sick, he cooled my forehead all night. When he had nightmares, I dragged my blanket to the floor beside his bed and announced that monsters were less brave when confronted by witnesses. My mother never called him lucky for surviving. She called him ours. That mattered more. In our kitchen, belonging was not a bloodline. It was soup homework, winter socks drying over the stove, and somebody noticing when you were quiet too long. Before the city ever knew his name, Elias learned ours properly. He learned that my mother swore when fish prices dropped that I hoarded peach candies inside my socks and that every Sunday we visited the Cliff Cemetery to greet the people the sea had kept. He made me flashcards from cereal boxes because we could not always buy new notebooks. He drilled multiplication tables while mending nets. If I answered correctly, he drew stars in the margins. If I answered badly, he drew larger stars and said hope should scale to need. The first time he smiled without reservation was when my mother let him stir the blackberry jam. He licked sugar from his thumb, looked startled by his own pleasure, and I understood that joy can scare people almost as much as pain when they are not used to either. By 13, Elias had become the pride of our district school. He solved math problems teachers saved for county competitions, rebuilt engines for fishermen, and still came home early enough to make sure I did not barter my lunch for comic books. He also developed the irritating habit of sounding like an 80-year-old magistrate whenever I made poor decisions.
Mara, he
would say, your courage is real, but your judgment remains under construction. I told him that if he kept speaking like a dusty law book, I would someday sell him to a library. He said any library sensible enough to buy me as a sister would deserve him as well. We were poor, but our poverty was at least honest. It smelled of Tidewater and soap, of my mother's fried bread, of borrowed textbooks, and secondhand coats. Nobody in our town hid hunger behind crystal glasses. That was why the city shocked me years later. But before the city came, there was a photograph. There is always a photograph before disaster puts on nice shoes. When county forms asked for guardian information, my mother wrote her own name beside his with such hard pressure that the pen tore the paper. Elias stared at the hole for a long time. Later he folded that copy and kept it in a dictionary. There were other small things too. The winter coat mended to fit him. 3 times, the town mechanic who paid him in peaches for helping after school, the librarian who quietly saved new science magazines because the they read boy reads like the roof will cave in if he stops. At 16, Elias won the provincial mathematics championship. The organizers placed all the students on a stage under lights hot as interrogation lamps. Somebody took a close-up when Elias was accepting the medal. The photo spread overnight because he was beautiful in the severe, accidental way that rich magazines try and fail to manufacture. But Beauty was not what caused the real explosion. A finance blogger posted a side-by-side image of Elias and Adrian Vale, the famous chairman of Vale Maritime Holdings. Same brow, same jaw, same unsettling stillness in the eyes. The caption read, "Either genetics is bored or a dynasty lost a son." Within 48 hours, lawyers arrived in our town. Then private investigators. Then a woman in pearls who cried before she had earned the right. DNA tests followed, and the C's miracle became a scandal. With chauffeurs, Elias was the biological son of Adrian and Celeste Vale, one of the wealthiest families on the eastern coast. Their infant son had been kidnapped during a hospital transfer 18 years earlier and declared dead after a failed search. The boy raised in his place, Julian Vale, was not blood, but by then he had 18 years of birthdays, photographs, expectations, and social alliances rooted around him like iron nails. Blood had returned too late. To be convenient, people in town treated the news as if one of our stray cats had turned out to be a panther. My mother listened to the lawyers in stony silence, then asked the only question that mattered: if he goes, will he be cherished or merely displayed? Nobody answered properly. Rich people rarely do when the truth is ugly. Elias watched the polished strangers as though he were studying a puzzle, whose answer might poison whoever solved it. He told my mother he wanted to see them only once. He wanted records, answers, and the truth about who left him on the road. He did not say he hoped for love, but I knew him too well not to hear the wish inside the silence. The Vales insisted he move to the city for security and integration. My mother nearly threw them out. Elias surprised us both by agreeing, though only on one condition: I would be transferred to a school nearby, and my living arrangements would be under his control. My mother packed him dried fish, pain tablets, and enough stern advice. To fortify an army, she packed me too, in a way buttons sewn stronger. Hems reinforced phone numbers written in 3 places in case city. Confusion erased my common sense. The morning he left, the harbor was all gray metal and gull cries. He hugged my mother first, then me. If they make you feel small, I whispered into his coat. Bite them, he answered with his mouth against my hair. That instruction may become relevant. That was how I left our fishing town and entered St. Aurelia Academy, where the floors were polished like mirrors and students wore boredom the way soldiers wear medals. Elias rented me an apartment near the gate, so I would not depend on the Vale household. He called every night for the first 2 weeks. Did I lock the door? Did I answer unknown numbers? Was anyone rude? Had I eaten vegetables? Did I understand, for the love of heaven, that certain people in that city mistook kindness for weakness? I told him the city had not swallowed me yet. He sent money anyway. Elias could be dramatic in practical ways. He feared silk ties and smiling adults much more than storms, and later I learned he had good reason. The first time I visited the Vale mansion, I understood why. He sounded tired over the phone. The house was enormous and perfect, and as warm as the inside of a marble tomb. Adrian Vale greeted Elias like a returning investment. Celeste Vale touched his sleeve as if checking fabric quality. Julian, the false her, smiled beautifully enough to be dangerous and welcomed me in a voice sweet with hidden blades. They gave Elias the largest study and the smallest share of ease. Every conversation was a test. Every dinner question was an exam he had not agreed to take. If he answered too little, he was cold. If he answered too well, Julian looked wounded. Julian had mastered the noble art of losing gracefully while making other people seem cruel. He let teacups slip when Elias entered rooms. He offered gifts publicly and apologies privately. He always looked as if tragedy loved him personally. At school, I heard whispers before I even learned the hallways. That is the country sister. No, the adopted one. No, she is the charity. Attachment. Wealthy children enjoy collecting misinformation the way poor children collect bottle caps. Then something unexpected happened. A line formed at my desk. Not to mock me, but to ask if Elias still did mathematics tutoring. Apparently, he charged city kids ruinous rates and expelled anyone who wasted his time. When I admitted that I could not do calculus, a boy with a ridiculous halo of dyed blonde hair peered at me in delight and announced, "Marvelous." At last, a normal person in this family orbit. That was Rowan Hart, heir to the Hart Media Group and trouble in polished shoes. Rowan had grown up between tabloids and boardrooms. He knew how to bow to old money while stealing the punchline from under its nose. People mistook him for unserious because he preferred laughter to posturing. Elias did not make that mistake twice. He also possessed the city's most refined nose for edible opportunity. Once, while explaining trust law to me in the library, he interrupted himself mid-sentence to identify by scent alone a contraband delivery of cinnamon buns 2 floors away. Rowan ate like famine followed him personally and spoke as if sarcasm were a native language. He also knew things. He knew how the Vale House functioned, which servants talked, which directors feared Adrian, and which stories about Julian were too neat to be true. We became friends over cafeteria food and mutual disrespect. He confessed he had been sent to the academy to develop discipline, which, in rich family language, usually means stop embarrassing the shareholders. I learned quickly that Rowan's family wealth did not protect him from loneliness any more than my brother's new surname protected him from contempt. Rich misery had better upholstery, but it still limped when it walked. One rainy afternoon, Rowan burst into my apartment without knocking, pale under his tan. "Come now," he said. "Your brother is on the observatory roof, and if I am wrong, I will buy you dinner for a year. If I am right, move." Later, he admitted he had gone looking for Elias because one of the rooftop security cameras, usually useless, showed a figure standing too still in the rain. Nobody your brother's age stands motionless in weather like that unless he is either composing poetry or planning.
Disaster, Rowan said.
Elias never struck me as poetry. I did not ask how he knew. His face had the sick look of someone who had seen a bad ending too clearly. We ran. The academy grounds blurred.
My
lungs burned. I prayed without dignity, the way desperate people always
do.
Elias sat on the edge of the observatory roof with one hand braced. Behind him, as calm as a person considering weather rather than death. The city lights below made everything look theatrical. I hated them for it. He turned when he heard me and smiled with exhausted apology. Mara, he said, go back. I only wanted a little quiet. Quiet, as if grief were a room one could politely enter and leave. I did not plead. Pleading would have made him gentle, and gentleness might have killed him. So I used the most disgraceful weapon I owned, my imagination. I shouted that if he jumped, I would wear black for exactly 3 days, cry beautifully at the funeral, and then chain myself to Rowan Hart for life, using his memory as moral leverage. Rowan made a strangled noise beside me. I continued mercilessly. I declared that I had already borrowed an appalling amount of money in Elias's name from 3 people in our hometown and planned to repay it. By marrying strategically and dishonorably, I explained in painstaking detail that if Rowan refused, I would simply engineer a kidnapping, force a shotgun wedding, and produce grandchildren before anyone could file paperwork. So really, brother, I concluded, die if you must, but at least do not complain later about the consequences. For 2 full seconds, the world stopped. Then Elias coughed out his sleeping pills onto the concrete, swore at me for the first time in our lives, and hauled himself off the ledge purely so he could continue swearing from a safer position. On the roof, under the rain, he shook with fury, relief, and some raw emotion too close to gratitude to name. Rowan looked at me as though he had just watched a saint commit armed robbery. Elias dragged me into a hard embrace afterward and said into my hair, never do that again, I answered honestly, then never make me that. Was the closest we came to discussing the roof for months. The day after the roof, my mother arrived from the coast without warning. She did not ask why. She cooked enough food for 6 people in my apartment kitchen, boxed half of it for Elias, and sat beside him on the sofa until he finally leaned his head against her shoulder like a boy far younger than 18. She told him no fine family was worth dying for and that blood only mattered when it carried oxygen. Elias laughed once, then cried in a way so soundless I had to leave the room. Some kinds of privacy should be guarded like sacred ground. Something in him changed after that night. Not healed healing is slower and less dramatic but clarified. He stopped trying to earn tenderness from people who measured human worth by usefulness and appearance. When Adrian Vale asked him to attend board dinners, Elias attended only if his academic schedule allowed. When Celeste tried to coach his speech, he listened with perfect courtesy and no obedience. When Julian staged little tragedies, Elias no longer rushed to mop up the tears. The family disliked this version of him more because they could not define it as rudeness. He was precise. He was calm. He was impossible to manipulate unless the subject was me. Julian noticed that at once. He always did have an excellent nose for a leverage. One evening, he found me in the library and said softly, you know, people like your brother are romantic until they become ambitious. Then they turn on whoever reminds them where they came from. I smiled at him with genuine admiration. That was almost good, I said. Another 6 months and you may become a
competent villain. He did not enjoy that.
The next week, I was accused of stealing a bracelet from a classmate. During a charity gala, it was a clever trap, timed and planted so that everyone would remember the country girl near the dressing room and nobody would question the tearful witness who spotted the evidence. Unfortunately for Julian, I had been raised by a mother who trusted no closed room and a brother who believed in receipts more passionately than some people believe in God. I filmed everything that night mostly because rich parties fascinated me the way disease fascinates doctors. So when the bracelet was discovered in my handbag, I cried exactly once, loud enough to gather a crowd, then asked the butler to connect my phone to the gala projector. Watching the footage of Julian's friend slipping the bracelet into my bag in high definition was, I admit, deeply satisfying. Julian looked devastated on cue. His mouth even trembled. But somewhere in the audience, Rowan laughed so hard he choked on sparkling water, and the spell broke. People can forgive a liar. They rarely forgive a liar who is no longer entertaining. I discovered that school factions and rich academies behave exactly like village gossip circles, only with better skincare. Alliances were built from crushes, shared tutors, and whose father controlled which charity gala. Human behavior changes costumes faster than it changes motives. Using this knowledge, I made strategic friendships with scholarship students, orchestra girls, the robotics captain who hated Julian on scientific principle, and 2 boys from the debate team who would have sold their grandmothers for a credible scandal. After that, the school divided sharply. Some still adored Julian because beautiful weakness is addictive. Others shifted toward me, mostly because nobody enjoys discovering they applauded the wrong performance. Rowan became my loudest ally and my worst influence. He taught me how to identify real watches, fake remorse, and board members who gamble. I taught him how to change a bicycle chain, bargain at street markets, and survive on snacks that cost less than his shoelaces. He started walking me home so often that even the security guards smirked. Elias saw it, of course. My brother missed nothing and approved, even less.
The Hart boy, he said one evening, has the attention span
of a magpie near jewelry. I replied that this was unfair to magpies, which at least build nests. Elias told me not to be clever at him. I asked him whom else I should use the skill on. He said he regretted teaching me punctuation. The article against Elias was followed by invitations designed to fail. Him, sailing events scheduled during exams, private dinners where old men asked for opinions they intended to mock, and panel discussions on resilience where Julian was conveniently seated beside grieving
Mothers.
Elias endured the first two, then declined the third by citing a mathematics seminar. Adrian called it arrogance. My brother replied that he would rather discuss numbers than cosplay sincerity. I nearly framed the message. Meanwhile, Julian escalated. He could not beat Elias in grades, and direct attacks had begun failing, so he turned toward reputation in the adult world. A journalist friendly to the Vales published a feature describing Elias as volatile, opportunistic, and ungrateful to the family that rescued him from obscurity. I read it aloud to Rowan in the cafeteria. He whistled low.
That, he
said, is not sloppy slander. That is orchestrated positioning. He was
right.
Somebody was preparing the board to doubt Elias before the annual succession review. Elias pretended not to care. I knew he did because he started working. Later, eating less and forgetting to argue with me when I stole his better pens. Grief had once pushed him toward a roof. Now ambition was pushing back, and both could kill in cleaner clothes. So I did the only thing that made sense. I declared war on the entire emotional climate of the Vale household, not openly. Open war favors people with lawyers. Instead, I waged guerrilla honesty. At dinner, I asked Celeste, in front of guests, whether she preferred sons who resembled her husband or sons who resembled her social strategy. She dropped her fork. At a fundraising luncheon, I wondered aloud whether Julian's charity speech had been written before or after he cut wages for the kitchen staff. The room froze. The chef sent me extra pastries for a week. When Adrian introduced Elias as the boy we have brought home, I smiled and asked whether he planned to bring home the truth next. He did not speak to me for 9 days, which remains one of my finer achievements. At the Hart greenhouse, Rowan showed me a cracked marble fountain and confessed that his own brother treated affection like a stock.
Option useful only if it increased value.
Maybe that is why I like your family, he said. You weaponize feelings honestly. I told him this was an outrageous claim. We never weaponized feelings honestly. We weaponize them theatrically, which is a much older and nobler craft. Rowan, to my annoyance, found all of this delightful. He called me a legal hazard wrapped in ribbons. I told him that if he kept grinning at my disasters, I would invoice him for emotional labor. One evening, he took me to the old greenhouse on the Hart estate, a place abandoned by gardeners and claimed by moonlight. There, for the first time, he stopped joking. Mara, he said, there's something wrong in the Vale finances. Not ordinary vanity. Something hidden. He had no proof yet, only fragments overheard from his brothers. Business meetings and one drunken complaint from a Vale accountant. But the fear in his face was real. If Elias challenges succession openly, he warned, they may bury him before he reaches the table. I carried that warning to Elias. He listened, expression flat, then asked Rowan 3 questions so sharp they might have cut paper from. Across the room, Rowan answered all 3 without flinching. That was when my brother finally stopped seeing him as a decorative fool. Respect from Elias always looked like cross-examination.
Rowan
survived it. I found that far more attractive than I admitted. We worked in layers. Rowan chased gossip through chauffeur channels and charity committees. I copied numbers, read annual filings, and learned more about offshore accounts than any schoolgirl should. Elias built timelines so neat they looked almost merciful. Sometimes we worked in my apartment until sunrise. Rowan snored on the
Rug.
Elias annotated contracts. I brewed tea strong enough to strip paint. Outside, the city kept pretending it ran on glamour, when really, it ran on exhausted people and badly hidden fear. Together, we began collecting what rich families hate most. Specifics. Dates, transfers, shell companies, old hospital records, trust, amendments filed at absurd hours, donations to institutions that never existed outside letterhead. The first true crack came from a retired driver. He had worked for the Vales 18 years earlier and left after a disagreement. No one explained.
Rowan found him in a coastal town 3 provinces away,
running a tea shop and pretending to enjoy retirement. At first, he denied remembering anything. Then Elias placed an old photograph on the table, one of himself as a toddler after the kidnapping, recovered from police archives. The driver's hands shook so violently he spilled tea into the saucers. He confessed before sunset. On the night Elias disappeared, Adrian's younger brother had arranged the kidnapping in hopes of destabilizing succession. But the child was not meant to vanish forever. He was meant to reappear after leverage was secured. The plan had gone wrong. The intermediary panicked when police pressure mounted and abandoned Elias instead. Adrian buried the scandal to protect the company. Celeste agreed to raise Julian as the replacement to avoid public humiliation. Truth was traded for continuity, and a child paid the price. When the driver finished speaking, none of us moved. Rowan stared at the wall. I wanted to burn the tea shop down just for hosting the words. Elias only said after a long silence, I see. His voice frightened me, more than shouting would have, but he did not go cold. He went exact. He filed copies. He met a lawyer independent of both families. He prepared not for revenge, but for extraction. That distinction matters. After Julian struck me, the school counselor asked whether I wished to avoid further confrontation by taking leave from classes. I thanked her politely and informed her that disappearance has always been the aggressor's preferred outcome. She never quite knew where to look after that. Julian discovered pieces of our movement sooner than we expected. He confronted me behind the auditorium after rehearsal, all softness stripped away. You think he will keep you once he wins? He asked. Men like Elias do not build homes. They build exits. I looked at him, truly looked, and saw not just malice but terror. Julian had built himself inside other people's need. If the need vanished, what remained? Almost enough to pity him. Not enough. I answered, maybe he leaves. Maybe he stays. But unlike you, I have known him when there was nothing to inherit. Julian slapped me before the sentence had fully landed. The sound echoed under the stage rafters. He looked as shocked as I. Felt. Then Rowan hit him so hard his cufflinks skittered across the floor. Like a silver insect. For one wild second, I considered applauding. The scandal could not be hidden after that. School administrators, family lawyers, and publicists swarmed like bees around dropped fruit. Julian cried. Rowan's mother threatened defamation suits. I demanded access to security footage and medical documentation with the calm of a person who had finally become dangerous on purpose. Elias arrived last. He did not ask if I was hurt until he was close. Enough to see the mark. Then he closed his eyes, opened them again, and told Julian in a voice quiet enough to terrify everyone, "You will never touch what is mine again." It was possessive and infuriating and exactly what I needed. From him in that moment, Julian, for the first time in his immaculate life, looked genuinely small. On the eve of the board meeting, Elias came to the coast. He sat on our mother's porch until long after midnight, saying almost nothing. She peeled shrimp into a bowl and finally told him that men who survive abandonment should be careful not to build their future from proving they deserve to be kept. He asked what he should build instead. She answered something that feeds more than your pride. In the morning he left before dawn, and I suspect the foundation was born in that chair facing the sea. The board scheduled an emergency meeting a week later under the pretense of addressing reputational damage. In truth, they wanted to decide whether Elias would be admitted into the trust structure or bought off. Quietly, before the succession review, Adrian expected compliance. Celeste expected sentiment. Julian expected a final chance to look tragic. They received none of those things. I wore my plainest suit to the boardroom on purpose. Rich people fear plain fabric worn without apology. It suggests you did not dress for their approval and therefore may have come for their secrets instead. Elias walked into the boardroom in a dark suit that fit him like an answer. I sat behind him with our lawyer. Rowan arrived separately with his brother's proxy votes and the board expression of a prince attending a tax seminar. Directors lined the table, each one polished, expensive, and privately frightened of whichever truth would lower their stock price. The windows overlooked the harbor. Somewhere beyond that gray water was the town, where my mother still mended nets and distrusted rich cutlery. Adrian opened with a speech about family. I nearly laughed aloud. When he finished, Elias thanked him for the lesson in performance and began handing out folders. Inside each folder were copies of the driver's statement, old police files, the concealed payout structure used to silence intermediaries, and financial transfers Julian had authorized through dummy charities. Over the last 2 years, Julian's head snapped up so fast I heard the chair scrape. He denied everything at once, which is the liar's version of prayer. Then Rowan slid a flash drive across the table and said mildly, "There is also audio." It turned out Julian had been siphoning discretionary funds with the help of a board member who assumed Elias would remain too eager for acceptance to look closely. Greed had piggybacked on old guilt. Dynasties rot in layers. Celeste went white. Adrian did not move. One director actually whispered, "Good God," as if God had just joined the meeting and taken notes. Our lawyer spoke next. He outlined civil exposure, criminal risk, inheritance violations, and the catastrophic consequences of allowing fraud to continue after discovery. His voice was so measured that panic had nowhere to hide from it. He also demanded reimbursement for every legal and educational expense my mother had borne while raising him without help from the family that should have carried those costs. "Send it to her directly," he said, "with interest. She has already financed enough of your silence." One director attempted to call this theatrical. Elias thanked him for the observation and asked whether the director preferred the scene where a kidnapped child is replaced or the one where adults profit from pretending not to notice. No one spoke again for a while. Then Elias did something none of them expected. He refused immediate installation as heir apparent. Instead, he demanded 3 things: full, public acknowledgement of the kidnapping cover-up, legal restitution, transferred into an independent foundation, and absolute operational distance from veiled family politics. The foundation, he explained, would fund rural education, trauma care for abandoned children, and legal advocacy for minors displaced by custody and trafficking failures. My throat tightened before I knew why. The room for once had no script ready. Adrian called it emotional blackmail. Elias corrected him. "No," he said. "This is accounting." Julian called him sanctimonious.
Rowan
Called Julian under indictment in everything but stationery. When the vote was taken, Adrian lost. Not because the directors had grown consciences, but because scandal with documentation frightens. Capital more than scandal with rumors. Greed had finally met better. Mathematics. Afterward, in the hall outside the boardroom, Celeste tried to touch Elias's arm. He stepped back. Not dramatically. Not cruelly. Just far enough to make history visible. She asked with tears she may even have meant whether there could be another chance. Elias answered, "For what motherhood we already spent." That? Then he walked away. Some doors do not slam. They simply refuse to open again. Julian's downfall was less elegant. There were investigations, asset freezes, interviews, and one memorable photograph of him entering a Courthouse with no expression beautiful enough to help.
I did not.
Celebrate. Ruin is not justice. It is only ruin. My mother refused the first transfer. She claimed she had not raised Elias to be sold back piecemeal. It took 3 phone calls, 1 argument, and a personal visit from our lawyer before she accepted the money on the condition that half immediately be redirected into the scholarship fund. She used the rest to pay old debts around the harbor that were not even hers, because gratitude in poor towns tends to circulate like weather. When Elias protested, she told him wealth should learn some manners before entering her bank account. The real victory came 1 month later when Elias signed the foundation charter and wrote my mother's name at the top of the community
Scholarship program.
June Reed Education Trust. Honest poverty, finally. Had a chair at the table. He bought her a house near the sea, large enough for guests and small enough to stay warm. She complained that it was extravagant, then filled every room with dried herbs, stubborn love, and the smell of soup. The public school I transferred into had chipped paint, louder teachers, and a chemistry lab that smelled permanently of burnt ambition. I loved it on sight. Nobody there cared what brand of shoes I wore. They cared whether I could solve the problem on the board before the bell. Rowan claimed the place was trying to kill him with fluorescent lighting. Then he started coming anyway, first to walk me home, later to argue with my classmates about policy, and finally, I suspect, because he liked being somewhere no one mistook cynicism for sophistication. I left St. Aurelia by choice and transferred to a public preparatory program with stronger academics and fewer liars per square meter.
Rowan
Called this tragic because the cafeteria pastries were worse. I called it liberation. He still found reasons to appear. Scholarship forms, physics notes, book I had once mentioned wanting, a repaired bicycle, a cactus, because, according to him, it matched my approach to social diplomacy. One evening at the harbor, months after the boardroom war, he stood beside me watching the tide erase our footprints and said with unusual seriousness, I think I stopped being hungry only when you started
Sharing your lunch.
I pretended not to understand. He sighed, patient for once, and tried again. Mara, I liked you before I knew what to call it.
I thought panic counted as a hobby.
I looked at him, at the gold gone softer in his hair under sunset, at the stubborn honesty it must have cost him to speak without a joke, and felt something in me settle like a boat reaching harbor at last. So I told him the truth. You are still ridiculous, I said, but now you are my ridiculous problem. Rowan grinned with such radiant relief that I had to look away or risk becoming sentimental in public. Elias watched the beginning of that romance with the suspicion of a man guarding a national archive. Rowan endured it heroically, which is to say he brought excellent tea, never arrived empty-handed, and survived 3 separate background checks he was not meant to notice. As for me, I finally understood that love is safest not when it is harmless, but when it has survived being tested by power and still chooses tenderness. At the Trust's first annual review, I presented outcomes in a room full of donors who expected a sentimental slideshow and received a 30-minute lecture on structural neglect, regional disparities, and why charity without accountability is mostly vanity wearing perfume. Several investors looked mildly injured.
Rowan
Seated in the back, looked so proud he might have floated. 2 years later, the first group of students, funded by the June Reed Trust, arrived on scholarships from fishing towns, factory suburbs, and mountain counties nobody in the capital had ever bothered to pronounce correctly. My mother cried through the opening ceremony, denied it, then cried again when Elias pretended not to see. He had grown taller somehow, or maybe pain simply no longer bent him. Children from the city and children from the coast sat in the same bright lecture hall, awkward and hopeful together. I wondered how many. Futures begin, not with genius, but with one adult refusing to look away. The newspapers still called Elias the reclaimed heir, though he never reclaimed the house itself. He reclaimed only what mattered, his own name, his own work, and the right to define success without kneeling to the family that had once mistaken utility for love. Julian eventually accepted a plea arrangement in exchange for testimony against the complicit director. I heard he now teaches accounting basics in a supervised reform program. I hope for his sake he learns the difference between performance and remorse. Adrian tried twice more to lure Elias back into the company with titles dressed as apologies. Elias declined both times with impeccable manners. Celeste sent birthday gifts that were returned unopened, some severances, our mercy, and colder clothes. Rowan entered university, switched majors twice, then finally settled on public policy after announcing that somebody in his bloodline ought to learn how systems fail people without charging them for the explanation. He still eats as if winter might return and lock the doors. I still hide the best food first. Certain romances are built on poetry. Ours seems to be built on theft prevention and shared exasperation. We visit the smokehouse sometimes, though it has long since caved in and surrendered to nettles. Elias always stands in the doorway a minute longer than necessary. I never ask what he sees there. Some ghosts deserve quiet attendance, not interpretation. Sometimes, late at night, Elias and I sit on the porch of my mother's house listening to waves strike the pilings. He asks whether I regret forcing him off that roof with the most scandalous speech of my life. I tell him no. Then I ask whether he regrets believing for one full minute that I would truly blackmail a rich boy into marriage. He answers every single time, Mara, with you, probabilities are not comforting. We laugh. Then we fall quiet. The silence between us is no longer the dangerous kind. It is the earned kind, warm and breathable. The kind shared by people who know exactly how close the dark once came. When the tide is high and the wind carries salt through the jasmine, I think about the photograph that changed everything. One face on a stage, one viral post, one dynasty startled by its own reflection. But if you ask me where the real story begins, I will never say the
Stage.
I will say a broken smokehouse, a barking dog, my mother's lantern, and a boy too hungry to believe in rescue. Because marble houses do not change the heart of a story. People do. A woman with soup, a sister with terrible ideas, a friend with noisy
Loyalty.
a boy who chose not to die. That is how houses learn to flinch. And if the sea still owes me miracles, I suppose this is how it pays. Not all at once, not fairly, but enough. Enough for a brother. Enough for a future. Enough for the sort of love that does not ask who you belong to before it decides to keep you. That is the whole truth, or at least the part of it that matters most. The rest is paperwork, newspaper clippings, and old money learning too. Late that children are not debts to be managed. My name is Mara Reed. Once, I prayed for an older brother and checked. The trees. The sea laughed. The storm answered. And somehow that ridiculous faith was enough to rewrite more than one life. If that sounds impossible, you have never met my family.